Hello and welcome to the next installment of Get Ready for Game Night, the YouTube video series primarily intended for my friends, where I try to teach you how to play some of my favorite games. I had a request to teach War of the Rings 2nd edition. This is sort of in preparation for the fact that the anniversary edition of this game is coming out later this year. This is certainly going to be the most complicated game I have ever attempted to teach. I will probably have to break it up into multiple videos, but hopefully watching this video series will get you ready to play War of the Ring. So let's get ready for game night. The basic idea behind War of the Ring is that we are retelling the story of J.R.R. Tolkien's classic fantasy novel, The Lord of the Rings. The story picks up from the moment that Sam and Frodo and all of the companions of the Fellowship meet here in Rivendell. There are two ways for each side to win. One side is going to play the Free Peoples. The Free Peoples player can win either by marching the ring here to the Crack of Doom and tossing the ring into its fiery depths, or by controlling 4 points worth of military victory at the end of a given round. The other player, controlling the Shadow, also has 2 ways to win. They can either have 10 points of military victory at the end of a round, or if they have pushed Frodo, the ring-bearer, up to 12 points of corruption, they win. I don't normally do a section in my videos on how to set up the game, but the setup of this game can be pretty intense, so I'm going to try to show you a very brief setup right now. To set up the game, first locate this piece here. This represents the Fellowship, Sam and Frodo, and any other characters that might still be in the Fellowship, and you start them here in Rivendell. Next, locate these 2 tokens. This represents the Fellowship of the Ring and how far they've traveled. This token has 2 sides, a side that represents the Fellowship being hidden, and a side that represents the Fellowship being revealed. It'll start hidden and on the 0 spot of the Fellowship track. Also locate the Corruption token. It looks like this. This represents how much corruption the ring-bearer has taken, and is also tracked along here, and it also starts at 0. Next, you'll have to find these cards here. They have portraits of the various members of the Fellowship on the back, as well as a description of their individual player powers on the front. Separate out the Gollum, Gandalf the White, and Aragorn Heir to Isildur card and set them aside. Take all the other companion cards and put them here in the Guide to the Fellowship. You should locate Gandalf the Grey and put him on top, as he starts as the Guide to the Fellowship, flipping his card over so you can read what he does. Also locate all of the miniatures that represent the companions in the Fellowship and place them here in the Fellowship of the Ring box. This represents everyone that is with the token, the Fellowship of the Ring, anywhere it is on the board. There's also a figure for Gollum that will be set aside for use later. You'll also have to locate these tokens. Every one of these tokens has a portrait of a member of the Fellowship on the back side. You shuffle them up and keep them here in the Fellowship box as well. There are also tokens for Aragorn, Heir to Isildur, and Gandalf the White. Those will be set aside with their corresponding cards. Locate this box here for the Elven Rings and place the corresponding rings in the box. These rings will come into play later, but they will allow you to change one of your action dice to anything that you'd like. You'll have to locate these cards here which represent the minions of the Shadow player. You have the Witch King, the Mouth of Sauron, and Saruman. Set them aside as they may come into play later, along with their corresponding minis. Next, you'll have to locate these cards here, which represent the event cards for the game. The red ones belong to the Shadow player, and the blue ones, the Free People's player. You'll divide them up into their corresponding decks, with the character deck represented by the sword, and the strategy deck represented by the banner symbol. Then place those decks in their appropriate spots. Up here for the Free People's player, and down here for the Shadow player. Next, locate these beige tiles. They're called hunt tiles, and they'll represent how much corruption the ring bearers will take when they're discovered by Sauron. Mix them up and put them into some type of opaque container. You'll be drawing randomly from them later. You'll also have to locate and set aside these 8 special hunt tiles. These are tiles that may or may not come into the game depending on which strategy cards are played. You'll simply set these aside for later on. You can tell which tiles are hunt tiles based on the back. Next, you'll locate and distribute the action dice used for the game. The Free People's player will start with 4, and the Shadow player will start with 7. The remaining 2 and 3 dice are set aside, and they can be earned later on in the game. On the far right-hand side of the board, you'll find the political tract. This needs to be set up with each nation involved in the game. The 3 Shadow nations all come out with their active side up, meaning the red background, and they go in these boxes here. The Free People's player, most of them come out passive, meaning they have the beige side up, and they come out in this area with one exception, the elves, which come out in this area, and they come out active with their blue side up. I want to point some things out on the map that'll be important later on for gameplay. You'll notice these thick black lines here. They represent mountains and can never be crossed by any player. You'll also notice that different areas of the board have different colored outlines. These represent the different nations of the peoples of Middle-earth. The yellow represents Saruman and Orthanc, the green, the elves. The dark red represents Sauron and his dark forces. The dark blue areas represent the people of Gondor, and the dark green areas represent the riders of Rohan. You'll note here's another mountain range that can't be crossed. The brown areas, found primarily in the northern part of the map, represent the dwarves. The light blue represents the men of the north, and the orange, which is only found on the far east and south parts of the map, represent the Southrons and Easterlings of Sauron. Let's take a minute to talk about the plastic figures in the game. There's a lot of them, over 200 in fact. The plastic figures are divided into the Free Peoples, that are mostly blue, and the Shadow, which are mostly red. They're also divided up by which nation they belong to. I've painted the bases to match the colors of the borders from the nations they belong to here. On your copy at home, the bases will not be painted. And they're also divided up into different types of army units. You have regular units, which are usually the smallest, elite units, which represent more powerful armies, and leaders, which are the gray plastic pieces. We'll talk about them more in detail later. The next and final step of the setup is to take all 205 plastic miniatures and assemble them on the board according to the instructions you'll find in the instruction manual. So when you're done with setup, the board will look something like this. You may immediately notice that in terms of the raw numbers of armies, the Shadow player has a huge advantage at the start of the game. By and large, most games will come down to the Shadow player winning through military might and achieving their 10 points worth of military victories. And the Free People's player is most likely to win through a fellowship victory, or by sneaking the Fellowship of the Ring all the way to the Crack of Doom, while just trying to withhold and stave off the military onslaught of the Shadow. Now that you know the basic idea of the game and how each side wins, as well as how to set up the game, let's get into the structure of a turn. The first thing that happens every turn is the recovery of the action dice and the drawing of the event cards. In every turn except the very first turn of the game, these action dice will have been spent by both players in the previous turn to carry out certain actions. So step one is to recover these action dice, both the ones you've spent as well as the ones that may be in the Hunt for the Ring box. Each player will then draw one card from each of their event decks, one from the character event deck and one from the strategy event deck. It is important to note at this time that at no time during the game is any player allowed to have more than 6 of these event cards in their hand. If you should end up ever having more than 6, you would have to immediately discard down to 6. We then move on to the Fellowship phase of the turn. In the Fellowship phase, the Free People's player can now declare the position of the Fellowship. We'll go more into this in detail later, but basically, if the Fellowship had been moved, as indicated on the Fellowship track in previous turns, they could declare them as being anywhere that is 2 spots away. For example, they could now declare that the Fellowship is 1, 2 in this spot here. Or, if they chose another route, they could say they are 1, 2 in the high pass, keeping in mind you can't cross these black, thick lines as they are considered mountains and impassable. If the Free People's player did declare the Fellowship, they would then reset this token back to 0, indicating that the Fellowship is exactly 0 spaces away from here, their last known location. If the Free People's player were to declare that the Fellowship is inside a stronghold of a Free People's nation, a few things happen. First, you would be able to cure 1 point worth of corruption. And second, if that nation has not been activated, they would immediately flip to their active side. In this case, because we had declared inside Helm's Deep, which is a stronghold of the Rohan nation, Rohan would now be considered active. The other thing that can occur during the Fellowship phase is the Free People's player can change who the guide to the Fellowship is. To explain this, we have to look a little more in depth at these character cards. Every one of these cards has 2 numbers on it. The upper number is that character's level, and the lower number is that character's leadership. Now, to be the guide of the Fellowship and take advantage of whatever special privileges being the guide grants you, the character must be at least tied for the highest level among all the companions still in the Fellowship. The only 2 companions with a level of 3 are Gandalf the Grey or, oh, where is it? Here he is, Strider, both with a level of 3. So at the beginning of the game, during the very first Fellowship phase, the Free People's player could decide, instead of having Gandalf as the leader or guide to the Fellowship, they could have Strider as the guide to the Fellowship. A little more in depth, their level also indicates how far these companions are able to travel when they break off from the Fellowship later in the game. And their leadership comes into play during battles. The next thing that happens is the Hunt Allocation, where the Shadow player can decide before he rolls any of his action dice to set them immediately to the Eye of Sauron face and put them in the Hunt for the Ring box or Hunt box. We'll cover this in more detail later, but every die that is in the Hunt box, when the Fellowship moves, the Shadow player will get to roll a d6 to try to find the Fellowship. So the more dice in this box for the Hunt allocation, the better the odds are of discovering the Fellowship when they move. There are a few rules. You must place one of these die in this Hunt box if, during the previous turn, the Fellowship used a die to move. Also, you're not allowed to put any more dice in the box than there are companions in the Fellowship at that time. So, if there were only 3 companions still in the Fellowship, not counting Frodo and Sam, then you would not be able to allocate these 4 dice. You could only allocate 3. After the Fellowship phase and the Hunt allocation, now it's finally time for the action roll, where each player will take all of their action dice, roll them, and see what they rolled. Now, if the Shadow player happened to have rolled any more Eyes of Sauron, they must immediately also place that in the Hunt box. After that's been done, the players, beginning always with the Free People's player, will alternate back and forth, spending one action die to carry out whatever action that die allows them to do. After the dice have all been spent, we would restart that entire process and go on and on until someone has won the game. What you can do with your dice, however, is not entirely dependent on the luck of the roll. The Free People's player starts with 3 Elven Rings, and at any point during the game, once per turn, they could spend an Elven Ring by flipping it over to change any die result to any other die result that they choose, with one exception. You are not allowed to change it to this die result here, which is called the Will of the West. After the Free People's player has spent this Elven Ring and flipped it over, he hands this to the Shadow player. The Shadow player would then place his Elven Ring down here in the Shadow Elven Ring box. And it works the same way for the Shadow player going forward. If the Shadow player were to have a die result that he didn't like, he can spend this Elven Ring to flip it to any other result. After the Shadow player spends an Elven Ring, the Elven Ring is discarded from the game. If the Shadow player elects to change a die result to an Eye of Sauron, that Eye of Sauron die immediately goes to the Hunt box. Okay, now let's actually start talking about what you can do with these dice. Let's start with what's called the event action. This face represents the Palantirs, I think they're called, from the movies and the books. And with an event action die, either player can either draw a new event card from either deck, the character deck or the strategy deck, or you can spend one of these die to play an event card from your hand. This symbol that you see here, they sort of look like little helmets, that is the muster die action for each of the 2 players. With a muster die, you can either take a diplomatic action, which is moving the political track of one of your nations one step forward or toward the at-war step on the political track, or you could play an event card if it had this muster symbol in the corner, as you can see here. Once a nation is both active and at war, it opens up more possibilities for the muster action die. For a single muster action die, a player can recruit to any active and at war army either 2 regular units or 1 elite unit or 1 regular unit and 1 leader. If you're recruiting either 2 regular units or a regular unit and a leader, each of those plastic figures must go to a separate army. These units can be recruited into any free settlement belonging to that nation. For example, these are Rohan units, so they could be recruited into any free Rohan settlement spending a muster action die. The Shadow player has one additional thing they can do with a muster action die, and that is recruiting the minions into the game. To get a minion into the game, they must first spend a muster action die, and they must consult the back of each of the minions' cards to see if they've met the requirements spelled out here for each card. If they have met the requirements to bring these minions into play, they may spend a muster action die and bring that minion into play according to the rules on the back of that minion's card. As long as that minion remains in the game, the Shadow player will benefit from any privileges that that minion brings, and perhaps more importantly, as long as that minion is in the game, the Shadow player will get to roll 1 additional action die every turn. So, if all 3 minions are brought into the game, then every single turn the Shadow player will be rolling 3 extra action dice. Next, let's talk about these dice here, which are the army dice. Now, you may notice that for the Free People's player, the army symbol, or the flag, or banner, never appears on the die alone. It's always accompanied with a muster symbol. Meaning for the Free People's player, the only way they can do an army action is by rolling this face of the die. With this face of the die, they can choose either a muster or an army action. Whereas the Shadow player does have a dedicated spot just for army actions. And if I'm not mistaken, they may even have 2, yes, because they also have an army muster side. So when you use an army die, you have several options. The first option is you can move 2 separate armies exactly 1 space. So the Free Peoples might move this army from Dal Almroth to Lambden, and then for a second movement they might move this army from Peligreer into Lawsonarch, and that would be a completely legal thing to do. When you're moving into a new area, that area must be considered free for the purposes of movement. What that means is you can't enter the area of another nation unless you're at war. So this army unit could not, if it were already here in West Ondor, it could not move south into Umbar, as we take a look down here. It could not move south into Umbar to attack because it is not yet at war. There are a few other things you can do. You do not have to move an entire army. You could split it. So for 1 army movement, you could split up this army in Minas Tirith and just move 3 of the regular units here and leave these guys behind. You can also merge armies with a movement. You could move these guys back here. That would count as 1 movement. You can also merge armies of different nations. If, for example, this unit were here and these units were here, for a single point of movement, you could merge the armies from Rohan with these armies from Gondor. And now you have a new army. So on the left-hand side of the board, are these 3 large army boxes, where you could take the entire army, put it in one of these army boxes, and then just use this token to represent anywhere this token goes represents this entire army. And there are tokens, number 1, 2, and 3, for 3 different large armies of each player. Another restriction that I sort of violated just a minute ago is that 2 armies of 2 different nations are not allowed to be together unless they're in an area that is not considered part of either nation. In other words, until they're at war, even though they are friendly to one another, a Gondor army cannot go into a Rohan-controlled area, and vice versa. Also, armies of opposing players are not allowed to freely move into a space that has any army units of the opposing player. Instead, you could use that army die to attack an army in an adjacent region. We'll cover the rules for battle right now. So let's look at a basic scenario of 2 opposing armies out in free, unoccupied land belonging to no nations. Honestly, this situation won't come up too often in the game, but this is the easiest scenario to explain. So let's say that the Shadow player has rolled an army muster die, and they choose to use this as an army die, and one of their 2 army movements is they're going to take this army and attack this one. Well, when you declare an attack and it's in open field of battle, a few things happen. First round of battle will occur, and the way a battle sequence works is everybody is going to look at all of the cards that they have in their hand, because these cards are double-sided. Well, they have a top half and a bottom half, I should say. The top half has to do with gameplay outside of battle, and the bottom half has to do with battles. You can choose one card from your hand to play before you begin the battle. Each player can do this. And they are done in secret and revealed at the same time. The card with the lower initiative, this lower number here, is the card that will have its effect first. In fact, I believe first the attacking army has to decide if it's going to play a card. Then the defending army can decide if it's going to play a card. And then the battles will occur. So you would carry out whatever the bottom half of the card says, and then you will calculate the strength of the army. The strength of the army is the total number of army units in the entire group, not counting the leaders. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 units for the Shadow, so their strength is 4, and for the Free People's player, their strength is 3. So each player would then roll a number of d6 dice equal to their strength, but it will never be more than 5. At no point in this entire game will you ever roll more than 5 dice. So I've allocated the brown dice to represent the Shadow Army and the green dice to represent the Free People's Army. And you're going to roll these dice simultaneously. And what you're looking for are 5s and 6s. 5s and 6s will score a hit. So in this case, you can see that the Shadow Army did not roll any hits, but the Free People's Army did roll a hit. But we're not done, because the reason you have leaders in your army is every leader offers you one re-roll of a failed die. So the Free People's player could re-roll this die. Oh, and they've scored a second hit. And the Shadow player could re-roll this die. And let's just pretend that they rolled a hit as well. So now you must take casualties. For every hit that is suffered against you, you must either lose 1 regular unit or downgrade an elite unit to a regular unit. Now, in this case, the Free People's player scored 2 hits, so effectively they would just lose 1 elite unit over here, if that's how they chose to take those hits. And because the Shadow rolled 1 hit, the Free People's player could either lose 1 regular unit, but, let's say they decide they're just going to downgrade their elite unit to a regular. That's a round of battle. Then each player has the opportunity. The attacker can decide if they want to continue the assault or stop the assault. If they stop the assault, you're done. If they choose to continue the assault, the defender has the opportunity to retreat. Following the same movement rules, however, they must retreat to an area that is free and not of another nation unless they're already at war. So they could, let's say if they're at war, they could retreat here. And that would also end it. And if they retreated and ended it, then the attacking army would have the opportunity to advance and take that spot that they just won in battle. Now, let's say they did not choose to retreat. Well, then you'd go through that same sequence again. The attacking army would choose if they want to play an event card. The defending army would choose. You would roll the dice, and then you'd have your leader re-rolls. You'd take your casualties and keep going until either someone decides to stop or retreat, or one army is completely wiped out. Now, leaders can never exist on their own. In fact, if this army is completely wiped out, the leader is immediately taken off the board as well. Now, something to note, in addition to just the regular leaders, if a companion that has separated from the fellowship, for instance, Gandalf the Grey, he might be with this army, in which case you would add his leadership to the army's leadership value in terms of rerolls. And if we look at Gandalf the Grey's card, you can see his leadership is 1. So this army's leadership is 2. 1 for the leader and 1 for Gandalf. There are other cards in the game. For instance, if you were able to get Aragorn, heir to Isildur, in the game, his leadership is 2. And this symbol here means whatever the normal strength of the army is, you would add a +1 to it. So if Aragorn, heir to Isildur, was here with this army, they would roll 3 + 1, so 4 total dice, and their leadership would be 3, so they'd get 3 rerolls. I also want to mention at this time that any Free People's players' armies that are killed in battle, they're out of the game forever. And if you try to recruit more of them, they must come from your reserve, not from the casualties that have been suffered. Whereas the Shadow people, whenever they take a casualty, this piece of plastic here goes back to the reserve and can be re-recruited with a muster action die. Now I want to talk about how battles are a little different if they're taking place in an area that has a fortification, a city, or a stronghold. The fortifications and the cities are both rectangles, and they both play the same way in terms of battles. The only difference between them is that a city is worth a victory point here for the attacking player if they can conquer it, whereas a fortification is not. It simply gives a little advantage to the defender if a battle takes place here. In fortifications and cities, in the first round of battle, instead of hitting on a 5 or a 6, hits will only occur on a 6. On subsequent rounds of battle, it's just like a battle in the open field. So basically, being in a fortified position gives the defense a little bit of an edge in the first round because they have the fortifications around them. Now, a stronghold, which are the big boxes here, offer even more protection because in addition to the first round of battle also only hitting on a 6 and not a 5 for the attacker, before battle even begins, the defending army can choose to retreat into the stronghold and basically set up a siege. So if the battle is taking place in an area that has a stronghold, before each round the defender can choose whether to fight normally or retreat into the stronghold. If they do, you will take all of the figures of that defending army and place them on the side of the board in the corresponding box representing that stronghold. The battle is now effectively over because once someone has retreated into a stronghold, a siege has begun and the rules for combat change a bit. Now, every combat will only ever last one round. So the attacker only gets one shot to attack a besieged stronghold. And just like with fortifications and cities, during that round of attack, the attacker who's attacking the stronghold must roll a 6 to score a hit, whereas the defending army inside the stronghold can hit on 5s and 6s. And again, it will only last one round. However, one of the advantages of having elite units in your attacking army is that they give you the ability to extend a siege. So, let's just say, for example, as my camera is drifting south here, let's fix that. Let's say that there was an attacking army that looked something like this against the besieged Helm's Deep. And they would have their one roll worth of combat, and maybe they have a leader, so they get their one reroll, and they didn't score any hits. And they're really bummed about that. They can push on with the siege for another round if they choose to voluntarily downgrade one of their elite units to a regular unit. If they choose to do that, they can attack one more time. And then, no matter how well or poorly it goes, they can choose again to downgrade an elite unit to a regular unit to attack again. As soon as they no longer have elite units in their army, then there will only be one round of combat for every attack or action die used because they don't have the elites to downgrade, so it's only going to be one round. In this way, the Free People's player, in most instances, can sort of just dig in and try to hold on and defend these areas that are all worth 2 military victory points as the ring bearers try to push the ring closer and closer to the crack of doom. If an army that contains a companion is ever completely wiped out, then that companion is also removed from the game. If that companion was either Gandalf the White or Aragorn heir to Isildur, the two companions that allow the Free People's player to get an extra action die, that extra action die would have to be removed in the next round. The same thing applies to the Shadow. If the Shadow was in an army and the entire army was wiped out and it contained one of the minions, say the Mouth of Sauron, if that entire army is destroyed, the Mouth of Sauron is also eliminated from the game, and the extra action die that came with him would also leave the game at the beginning of the next round during the recover action dice phase. Also, If you have an event card that has the matching symbol in the upper right as an army event die, or action die, you can use that die to play that card. And in fact, that theme holds true for all of the cards. You can always play a card with the event side of the die. That face can be used to play any card. And in fact, that symbol is in the upper left of every card. But every card also has a symbol in the upper right. And if you roll a die that matches that symbol, that means that card can be played by spending that die. Next, let's talk about the character dice that have these little sword or dagger symbols. The first thing that a character die can do is it can move an army just like an army die can, with a few little exceptions. Number one, it can only move an army if it has a leader with it. It cannot be used to move an army without a leader. Secondly, when you use a character die to move armies, you're only allowed to move one army, whereas the army die allows you to move two separate armies. Another thing that a character die can be used to do is to move the fellowship. Now, the actual act of moving isn't very exciting. You simply say, I'm using this die to move the fellowship, and then you would slide the Fellowship of the Ring counter one space along the track. However, what happens immediately after that is what gets interesting. After the Fellowship has moved, Sauron has detected that the ring has been moving, so he is going to try to hunt for them. So what we do is the shadow player looks to the hunt box to see how many eyes of Sauron are hunting for the ring, in this case 2, and for every eye of Sauron in that box, you're going to roll 1d6 to try to find the ring. When you make this hunt roll, you will only find them on a 6. Bummer. The Fellowship can move on. But after that movement occurs and the roll is unsuccessful, the die that was used to move the Fellowship is then placed inside the hunt box. The reason being, if the Fellowship chooses to move a second time during this same game round, well, then the shadow player is going to again roll their 2d6, but now for every blue die in the hunt box, they get a +1 modifier to the roll. So now he'll find them on a 5 or a 6. Oh, disaster. The hunt has been successful. Let's take a look at what happens when the hunt is successful. One other aspect to the hunt for the ring is that depending on the last known location of the ring bearers, the shadow player may get to re-roll a certain number of hunt dice, and all modifiers would apply. Those 3 conditions are: if the last known location was inside of a shadow-controlled Shadow Stronghold, or if the last known location is with any number of shadow armies, or if the last known location is with any number of Nazgul. And for the purposes of this, as well as all game purposes in fact, the Witch King is considered a Nazgul. So since all 3 conditions apply, the shadow player would get to re-roll their hunt dice 3 times. That is, 3 failed die could be re-rolled in their attempt to roll a 6 or lower with modifiers to find the ring bearers. If the hunt is successful, then the shadow player gets to go into the hunt pool here and pull out one of those tokens that we put in here earlier. Pulls out 1, and it is a 2. What that means is that the ring bearers must now suffer 2 points of corruption or make a heroic sacrifice. So in the example we just saw, the ring bearer's first option is to take 2 points worth of corruption, going up 2 points on this track, remembering that if this ever reaches 12, the game is over and the shadow has won. But the Free People's player has another choice. Instead of taking that corruption, they could choose to have one of the companions that are still in the fellowship, they cannot have left, to lay down their life in protection of the ring. Now, here's how that would work. They can choose to either have the guide to the fellowship sacrifice his life, in which case here it would be Gandalf, or they can choose a random member of the fellowship to be sacrificed. And that's what these little tokens are for. They get mixed about, and then one is randomly selected. In this case, Legolas would have laid down his life for the fellowship. Whoever is killed, their figure and their token and their card is immediately removed from the game. But was it enough of a sacrifice? You must check the sacrificed player's level, in this case 2 for Legolas. If the number of corruption points that would have been inflicted on the fellowship is greater than the level of the companion that sacrificed themselves, then the remaining corruption still must be taken by the ring bearers. So in this case, if the hunt tile had been a 3 and Legolas sacrificed himself, he would have absorbed 2 of that corruption, and the final corruption point would still have to be taken by the ring bearers on the corruption track. But let's take a look at some of the other hunt tiles that might come out and explain what they mean. If the hunt tile has the Eye of Sauron on it, then the amount of damage taken is equal to the number of successes that were rolled during the hunt. That's why it's important to keep track of how many successes are rolled. You may also notice this small symbol on the bottom of the hunt tile. That means that in addition to taking whatever amount of corruption or damage, that the fellowship has been revealed. So if the fellowship is revealed, either from a hunt tile or from an event card, first, the Fellowship of the Ring counter is flipped to its revealed side. Immediately, the Free People's player must move the Fellowship of the Ring from their last known location to any location up to 3 spaces away. 1, 2, 3. Following the same movement rules. Once the fellowship is revealed, this counter will go back to 0. And the fellowship is not allowed to move again until some game event hides it. If, during the movement after the fellowship has been revealed, the fellowship and ring bearer moved through, started on, or ends on a shadow-controlled evil stronghold, well, things just got way bad for the ring bearers because a second hunt tile must now be drawn and resolved. If things weren't bad enough for the ring bearers, if they are revealed during a hunt for the ring, even if they had enough movement points to get them there, they are not allowed to end their movement in a Free People's city or stronghold. So that brings us back to another action that the Free People's player can do with their character action die. If they happen to be revealed at the time, meaning the token looks like this up on the fellowship track, they could spend a character action die to hide the fellowship, and that's their entire turn. The last thing that the fellowship can do with a character action die is separate companions from the fellowship. To separate a companion or group of companions from the fellowship, you would spend the character action die and then decide which companion or group of companions you want to break off. There are many reasons why you might want to do this. Many of the companions grant special abilities if they show up in their home nation, as well as their leadership ability for battle. So, when you separate your companions, you decide who is being separated and then look at their level. Again, let's say we wanted to separate Gimli, who has a level of 2, and he's going to take Merry with him, who has a level of 1. You would grab their 2 miniatures, and they would move together away from the last known location of the Fellowship, a total number of spaces equal to the current position on the Fellowship track, plus the highest level of anyone in the group that's separating. So since Gimli is 2, and the last known position was 3 spaces away, this group could travel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces away, probably headed off to a dwarven nation so that Gimli can activate the dwarves. If the Shadow player decides to use a character die to move their leaders, which is sort of their version of separating companions from the Fellowship, they can move every single one of their Nazgul. And the way the Nazgul move is they can fly. So every single Nazgul can leave any space on the board and land anywhere else. The only restriction on the Nazgul movement is that they cannot land in an area of a Free People's stronghold unless that Free People's stronghold is under siege. So again, for a single character die, the Shadow player can move all of their Nazgul anywhere on the board. At some point, it will become apparent that the ring bearers are about to enter Mordor, and then the rules change a little bit. During the Fellowship phase, if the Free People's player can, based on their movement from last known position, declare the position of the Fellowship, either here in Moranon or here in Minas Morgul, then a few fundamental rule changes occur. First, you place the Fellowship immediately on step 1 of the Doom track. Any and all companions that might still be with the Fellowship are immediately eliminated and taken out of the game. And Smeagol immediately becomes the new guide to the Fellowship. Here's where, if you want, you can put Smeagol or Gollum with the Fellowship of the Ring. The next thing that happens is that any and all beige eye hunt tokens that were pulled out during gameplay up to this point are taken out of the discard pile and put back into the bag for the hunt for the ring. Also, during gameplay, various special hunt tiles may have come into play, either that benefit the Free Peoples or the Shadow. Those tiles would also now be placed into the Hunt for the Ring bag. From now on, whenever the ring bearers try to move, usually through using a character action die, you don't actually move the Fellowship counter, you simply declare, I'm using this to move. And instead of having a normal hunt from the ring, a hunt for the ring, the Shadow player would immediately draw a hunt tile as though the hunt were successful, following the normal rules. When on the Mordor track, an eye does not mean that the Fellowship suffers corruption equal to the number of successful hunt rolls, since there were no hunt rolls. They suffer corruption equal to the total number of dice, Shadow and Free People's dice, that are currently in the hunt box. Also note that at this point, the Fellowship would be revealed, and the same rules apply. They cannot move forward on the track unless they are hidden, so they would have to spend another character die or use some other game effect to become hidden again before they could advance on the track on their next turn. All of the special hunt tiles that benefit the Shadow player contain this small icon here that is a stop icon. And what that means is, in addition to taking whatever damage is allocated here and becoming revealed, they don't get to move forward, and in fact they go nowhere after taking the damage. This hunt tile comes from playing a card I believe called Shelob's Lair, and it's nasty. Basically, if this hunt tile comes out during the hunt for the ring, the Shadow player will roll a d6, and the Free People's player will have to take however many corruption points are rolled. Also, note the stop icon. They don't advance on the Doom track at all. Another thing getting in the way of the Free Peoples at this point is the rule that if at the end of the action resolution phase, the Free People's player has not attempted to move at least once or to hide the Fellowship on the Mordor track, in other words, you look at the state of the board and they are both revealed and no dice have been used to move them, well, they automatically take 1 corruption. Now, all is not lost for the Free People's player because there are event cards during the game that might bring tokens into the hunt bag that actually reduce corruption, and those would be in play at this point. If after you successfully have a hunt and from this point here you say, I'm moving the Fellowship, you would draw a hunt tile. If that hunt tile does not end the game by pushing them to 12 corruption, then the Free People's player would march onto the Crack of Doom, toss the ring into the fiery pits, and they have won. The last die face I have to talk about is this one. It's called the Will of the West. And it's basically a wild card for the Free People's player. They can change the Will of the West to any face they want during their turn before they spend a die. And they don't necessarily have to spend the die that they just changed. Like maybe they want a character die. They could say, I'm going to make this a character die, but I'm going to now spend one of my other die that's not this one. That's perfectly acceptable. The other thing that the Will of the West is good for is that a Will of the West die is required to bring both Aragorn, heir to Isildur, and Gandalf the White into play. You must meet the requirements printed on those cards, spend a Will of the West die, and then those 2 characters can come into play, and they are very powerful. In addition to the special abilities printed on their cards, each of those characters will give the Free People's player an additional action die to spend and roll every turn as long as those 2 characters are in the game. Well, I may have made some mistakes along the way. I may have forgotten a few of the smaller rules, but I think I've given you everything you need to know to sit down and start playing War of the Ring, at least the 2nd edition rules, designed by Roberto Di Maligio, Marco Maggi, and Francesco Nipileteto, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, and produced by Ares Games. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments below. If you like what I'm doing here, you can like and subscribe. And yeah, hopefully now you're ready for game night.